I unexpectedly found myself witnessing my husband's affair, an experience I believe to be quite rare. Most people discover infidelity through incriminating messages on their smartphones, but in my case, I saw it unfold right before my eyes. What's even more shocking is the place where it happened, witnessed by numerous people. I'm Sarah, a full-time homemaker, and we have a 10-year-old son. On the day I stumbled upon this affair, my husband had a day off, and we had planned a family outing. However, when I woke up that morning, I realized my husband was already gone. There was a message on my phone from him explaining that my sister-in-law had a mild fever of 36 degrees Celsius, so he decided to take care of her since no one else was home. He assured me he'd be back in the evening. I couldn't help but sigh deeply. I had promised our son a trip to the amusement park that day, and he had been eagerly looking forward to it since the previous day. My husband had been buried in a major project at work for the past 6 months, rarely taking a break. So this day off was a precious opportunity for family time. However, he chose to attend to his sick sister. Now, you might wonder what the problem is. After all, he's helping his ailing sister, right? Well, here's the issue. My husband has what some might call a sister complex. He used to tell me, "You're wonderful because you're just like my sister," and that always gave me an uneasy feeling. His sister is remarkably beautiful and kind, and I suppose resembling her is the highest form of compliment from my husband. However, it always made me uncomfortable, despite the frustration it brought. The real problem is his tendency to disappear every morning, even on his days off. On his days off, couldn't he at least spend quality time with our child, who is undeniably a daddy's boy and often cries for his attention? When my husband is absent, he shows a striking indifference toward our son. He doesn't even bother to prepare birthday gifts or participate in school events, no matter how much free time he has. Sometimes, even when he returns home early, he simply retreats to his room, immersing himself in video games. He rarely engages with our son, who once adored him. If this pattern continues, our son may eventually start seeing his father as a stranger. Speaking of my husband being busy with a major project, that was a complete lie. In reality, he hardly ever spends time at home. Once, I asked a former classmate who works at the same company as my husband about his workload. To my surprise, my classmate burst into laughter and revealed that my husband is actually a minor employee with minimal work responsibilities. He consistently leaves work on time and never looks exhausted from overtime. Even though he claimed to be managing a major project, his salary remains around 200,000 yen. Despite my growing frustration, I went ahead and prepared breakfast. However, something fell off. Typically, my husband wakes up by 7 a.m. even if I don't wake him. But today, the clock had already passed that time, and he risked missing our child's nursery school bus. Rushing, I went to my son's room to wake him up. To my concern, he was still sound asleep. As I gently nudged him, instead of responding, he groaned in pain. Panicked, I reached out and touched his forehead. It was burning hot. When I called his name and lightly shook his shoulder, he weakly murmured, "Mom, it hurts." I was on the verge of panic. At the time, there had been an outbreak of an illness at the daycare center, and I feared my son had caught it as well. I had heard of cases where people didn't survive this illness, so I was genuinely terrified that my son might not recover. I decided to call my mother for advice on first aid, since she had a nursing background and could offer valuable guidance. I made sure my son drank plenty of fluids while we waited. According to my mother, there was a risk of heat stroke, and considering the possibility of an infection, I couldn't accompany him in the ambulance. I quickly called a taxi and headed to the hospital where he would be taken. All the while, I kept trying to contact my husband, even though deep down, I knew it was futile. In desperation, I left him an online message, hoping he would notice and come to our aid if he still felt any sense of responsibility. Upon arriving at the hospital, I anxiously waited in the corridor outside the emergency room, silently praying for my son's recovery. Memories of my father, who had once been taken into the emergency room and never came out, haunted my thoughts. I couldn't help but imagine the worst-case scenario. What if my son didn't make it either? My mother, who had rushed to the hospital, provided some much-needed comfort, assuring me that everything would be all right. An hour later, my son miraculously recovered, though the doctors recommended he stay hospitalized for at least a week. Consequently, he was moved to a ward. To my disappointment, my husband didn't return home that day. The following day, I decided to visit my son in the hospital, bringing along a change of clothes and some fruit for him to enjoy. I also wanted to express my gratitude to the doctor who had cared for him the previous day. As I walked past the emergency room, the atmosphere suddenly turned chaotic. In desperation, I tried calling my husband, but he didn't answer any of my calls or respond to my emails. There was no time to wait for a reply. I considered postponing my visit to the doctor, thinking that perhaps an emergency case had arrived and I didn't want to get in the way. Just as I was about to head to my son's ward, I spotted a man and a woman being carried on a stretcher, barely covered by a blanket, almost as if they were naked. It seemed like they were still somehow entangled, possibly in one of those bizarre situations where certain physical aspects wouldn't disengage after an intimate encounter. Though I had never experienced it myself, I imagine it must be quite troublesome. Being transported in such a state had to be incredibly embarrassing. As I pondered this and prepared to walk past, I inadvertently made eye contact with the man. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an awkward situation, but for me, it was different. I was utterly stunned because the man turned out to be my husband. "Why are you here like this?" I exclaimed in shock. He seemed at a loss for words, and I was equally bewildered. My son had just been admitted yesterday, and now my husband was in a similar predicament. What were the odds of that? Furthermore, why was my husband being transported in such a vulnerable state, and who was the woman with him? My mind was flooded with a whirlwind of questions. Amidst all the confusion, I accidentally made eye contact with the woman entangled with my husband. Even in my state of perplexity, I immediately recognized her. She was my husband's mistress. As I glared at her, I suddenly realized why her face was so familiar. Then I heard her voice, and everything clicked. Yes, that woman was Amelia, my husband's sister. In that moment, time seemed to stretch infinitely. I had suspected my husband of lying about taking care of his sister and meeting another woman, but I never anticipated this. Even if he had come to visit our son, he should not have arrived in such an intimate situation. However, the woman turned out to be his actual sister. There had to be limits to how much one could deceive. They were taken away on a stretcher, and all I could do was restrain my urge to confront them and wait. After all, there was no way for them to escape. I decided to address this later. With that thought in mind, I headed to visit my son, still feeling uneasy deep down. I spent some time in his room, trying to sort out my emotions. When I casually checked my phone, I noticed a multitude of messages from my husband online. Upon reading them, it was clear he was attempting to cover up his actions. He didn't even mention our son's hospitalization. I chose to continue ignoring him and waited for another hour. Then, the doctor who had been in charge of my son the day before appeared. The doctor smiled at me and said, "Your son is doing remarkably well. He might be discharged earlier than expected. His fever has subsided and his condition has completely stabilized. Initially, I was concerned about an infectious disease, but it appears he had heat stroke in addition to a cold. You made sure he drank plenty of water, didn't you? That was the right move. You're a smart mother, and your son must be grateful. He even praised me. If anything, it was thanks to my mother's advice. I sincerely thanked the kind doctor and expressed my gratitude. However, beneath the surface, I knew I was about to face quite a storm. I had just felt relieved about my son's recovery, but inside, I was boiling with anger. My face might have appeared calm, but I had inadvertently frightened my son. I quickly put on a smile and assured him I would be right back before stepping outside the hospital and calling my husband, who had left more than 100 unanswered calls. The moment my husband answered, he launched into a flurry of excuses. "It's not what you think. There's a reason." It was evident that he had his priorities all wrong. Shouldn't he have been worried about our son first? There was no way a man who had been so engrossed in his activities with his own sister, completely disregarding our son, could be genuinely concerned about him. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person my husband had become. Concerned about my son's future, and recognizing that my husband's character was unlikely to change, I made the difficult decision to divorce him. I knew life might become challenging, but I was willing to endure it for the sake of my son. I confronted my husband, saying, "You prioritized that even when our son was suffering, didn't you? You've always made time for it whenever you could. And with your own sister, it's truly disgusting." My husband was left speechless, and I continued, "Oh, and by the way, I've already informed your parents about this. I won't involve your company. It might be troublesome if you can't afford alimony and child support payments. So, goodbye." Expressing my final decision, I told my husband that I had already signed the divorce papers. 3 days later, my son's health improved more rapidly than expected. After completing the discharge procedures, we returned home together for the first time in a long while. Naturally, my husband wasn't there. After some time, amidst all the turmoil, my husband appeared in person to apologize. However, I presented him with the already signed divorce papers. He pleaded, "It was my first time. Please forgive me for this one mistake. You're all I have." I coldly responded, "So you're still lying at this point? I already know everything. Your sister confessed to everything." I had anticipated that my husband wouldn't easily agree to a divorce, so I decided to confront his sister, the person directly involved. "Sister-in-law," I began, "I heard you're going to have a wedding ceremony with your fiancé." Her eyes widened as she exclaimed, "No way. You're not planning to reveal this, are you?" I smiled and said, "Yes, because I want everyone to understand what kind of person you are. If I disclose this, it will be crystal clear to everyone." She looked anxious and pleaded, "Please, anything but that. If you do that, my life will be ruined." Pretending to consider her request, I smirked and said, I guess we can't help it then. Here's an alternative. I will keep quiet about this matter if you provide me with all the details of your involvement with my husband." I made a promise to my sister-in-law, ensuring that I would keep her secret. She confessed everything without hesitation, begging me not to reveal her actions to her younger brother. When I finally confronted my husband with this revelation, he was so shocked and overwhelmed that he fainted. When he regained consciousness, he signed the divorce papers and left the house in despair. From that point on, I enlisted the help of my lawyer to proceed with the divorce, gain custody of our son, and secure alimony and child support from my husband. He tried to negotiate the amount, but when I whispered in his ear that I could expose the truth to his company, he conceded and agreed to pay the amount I had demanded. He left the lawyer's office with a heavy heart. Somehow, news of what had happened reached his company, and my husband was summoned and severely reprimanded. A month later, he was dismissed from his job and ended up working at a food factory, packing strawberries and cakes to meet his alimony and child support obligations. Even there, his reputation followed him, with young girls constantly gossiping about him, making him uncomfortable. As for my husband's sister, although I hadn't exposed her directly, the truth eventually surfaced, and she was dumped by her fiancé. It turned out that her boyfriend, like me, had suspected infidelity and hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance. As a result, she was ordered to pay a significant sum as compensation for breaking off the engagement. Now, she appears to be working at a nightclub. One day, her ex-fiancé handed me a photo of them together, saying, "Use it if anything happens." I wonder what had compelled him to give such a thing to a woman like me, but I decided to keep it in my dresser just in case. I moved back to my parents' home to start anew, working hard to raise my son with their support. My parents had longed to see their grandson since they lived far away, and they assisted me as much as they could. However, I didn't want to overburden them, so I only sought their help when necessary. By the way, my son, who once suffered from a high fever, has been healthy ever since. 3 years later, he is consistently recognized for perfect attendance at school. He seems to have completely forgotten about his biological father and enjoys his life to the fullest every day. That is what brings me the greatest happiness. Oh, and I have a new addition to the family, a white cat named Snow. Snow used to frequent my yard before I moved, and when I said my final goodbye, it climbed onto my lap and refused to leave. So, I decided to bring Snow home with me. Now, Snow has become an important part of my family, cherished just as much as my son. I look forward to watching my son grow, surrounded by my parents and Snow. As I stroked Snow on the porch, I reflected on these thoughts.